Welcome back to the Korean podcast. I'm your host, Lea-Henry, and on today's show we have a returning guest for the third time. I will link both other podcasts below, but previously we spoke about a similar topic the first time around, which was North Korea's relationships with the Third World. And most recently, a little over a year ago today, we spoke about the axe murder incident on the DMZ, again, which I'll link below. But importantly, our new guest here, our returning guest, has a book out, and this is called Guns, Guerillas, and the Great Leader, North Korea and the Third World. This is Ben Young, assistant professor at Dakota State University, soon to be assistant professor at Virginia Commonwealth University. Ben, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks for having me on, Jed. It's always nice to talk to you.
Always a pleasure to have you back on, and always so interested in details to talk about. So let's launch into your new book. We're going to focus on two particular episodes within it, Cuba and Palestine. But I might start and we'll walk through the chapters a little bit to give people an understanding of the overall content and where we are in our time frame and what we're speaking about. So let's start with the first chapter. This is called titled Building a Reputation, 1956 to 1967. It's a chapter that talks about the end of the Korean War, relationships with surprising countries like Indonesia, the Vietnam War. So take us there, and then we'll jump into Cuba.
Yeah, so my book follows a roughly chronological approach. It goes from about the mid-1950s to the end of the Cold War era. My first chapter is actually perhaps my favorite chapter because it looks at three important diplomatic relationships for Pyongyang. The first is the Cuban-North Korean alliance. The second is the Indonesian-North Korean alliance. And the last one is the Vietnamese-North Korean alliance. I personally always found the Cuban-North Korean alliance to be under-researched, but just an absolutely fascinating tale of two countries that saw themselves in the front lines of anti-U.S. imperialism. And they kind of had this shared geographic imaginary where they really did see themselves as like, we're on the front line of this global revolution, and we are brothers in arms, and we are comrades, and we are fighting the U.S. Goliath. For Indonesia, the case of Indonesia is also very interesting because up until 1965, there was a regime in Indonesia that was left-leaning and had relatively close relations with Kimmelson. Sukarno was the leader of the leftist regime in Indonesia, and he invited Kimmelson to come to Jakarta, and in Jakarta, Kimmelson actually gave one of his most important speeches about Juche, and that is also where flower was named after Kimmelson, the Kimmelson Ilya. And it was actually Sukarno who gave Kimmelson that name for the flower. So that's part of Kimmelson's own personality cult in North Korea. And the Vietnamese-North Korean relationship was also quite close, especially during the Vietnam War, and that is principally because the North Koreans saw Vietnamese reunification as kind of like a test case for their own struggle for unification that they later hoped to achieve with the South. And so Kim Il-sung, he sent about 100 pilots or so to Vietnam, and he kind of saw the Vietnam War as almost a mini case study for perhaps a future conflict on the peninsula.
So let's jump into Cuba then, and jump into Cuba with some detail. And you touched on it really interestingly there, but I might just focus on it again. This natural kind of relationship. Many people who have not much experience or history in the content and the topic may not think that it's a natural relationship. But I might quote you here, and as soon as you begin to put it in this context, it begins to make sense. So, led by former guerrilla fighters and predisposed to despising the U.S. government based on violent historical experience with the U.S. armed forces, the two leaderships became natural allies. And it seems to be just the case, as in they seem to be, when you look at it in those terms, these two countries are in fact natural allies.
Yeah, so North Korea it was termed by two scholars, Wada Haruki and Adrian Buzo, as a guerrilla state. And I actually think that's a really good characterization of the regime, because Kimmelson was a guerrilla who fought against the Japanese, and most of his former comrades that fought in his resistance band later became the key political elite of North Korea. And all they knew for a long period of time was fighting, how to be a guerrilla fighter. And I think they brought the same ethos and the same mentality to their governance and how they orchestrated North Korea's foreign policy. And so naturally, they would find allies with other former guerrillas turned national leaders, whether that was Fidel Castro and Che Guevara in Cuba, or whether that was Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam, or even African strongmen like Yoweri Museveni in Uganda. There was kind of like this sympathy for other anti-colonial struggles, because Kim Il-sung also understood what it was like to be colonized. He understood what it was like to struggle against a bigger imperialist power. So I think there was a degree of solidarity and kind of internationalism that the North Korean regime supported during the 1960s, 70s, and even up until the 1980s.
And importantly in this, more than just the anti-imperialistic struggle, the common enemy is important here as well. This is America, of course. North Korea had just been bombed heavily with extraordinary amounts of napalm, and they had ingrained this in their psychology here. And you write, and this is important to note, that when North Korea looks across at Cuba, they don't see another country that is in the anti-imperialistic struggle, but a country that in so many ways in the 1960s is actually on the forefront of that anti-American struggle.
Yes. North Korea, Cuba, and Vietnam were actually, they saw themselves as their own movement. There is a quote from the Cuban foreign minister in my book where he talks about how there was a Cuba, Vietnam, and North Korea kind of axes of world revolution. And he said that these were the sole kind of actors when it comes to actually defeating imperialism. The Soviet Union talked a big game, but didn't actually back it up. China was undergoing the Cultural Revolution with all of its chaos and kind of confusing policies at times. But Cuba, North Korea, and Vietnam, they saw themselves as really being truly and genuinely anti-colonialist and anti-imperialist. These three governments thought that they were on the front lines of the struggle, that they were really the ones who are backing up the rhetoric with the actual aggression against what they thought was brutal U.S. imperialism. And so you have the North Koreans sending Cuba aid. There was a hurricane, Hurricane Flora, I believe it was, and the North Koreans sent aid to the Cubans. The North Koreans even later sent workers to help Cuba during their sugarcane harvest. There was like symbolic gestures as well. There was a North Korea-Cuba Solidarity Week. There was farms named after Cholima in Cuba. There was really kind of this international solidarity between Havana and Pyongyang. And some of that even continues today. If you look at North Korean state-run media, a lot of it is like, what did Kim Jong-un do today? But there's also messages that they receive from like friends abroad. And they still get a lot of messages, and they still send a lot of symbolic gestures to the Cuban government. And so there's almost kind of this oddball socialist international which exists today in it Cuba, North Korea, Venezuela, Syria, Vietnam, Laos, China are kind of like the key players in that movement. But, that kind of nostalgia for this period of internationalism is still around.
Let's talk about, and you mentioned it briefly just before, November 1960, and when the Cuban Minister for Industry, and this is Che Guevara, as you mentioned, he goes to China and he meets Chinese Vice Chairman Zhou Enlai, and Zhou Enlai, after their meeting, encourages him to go and visit the North Koreans, and he encourages him to do so in terms of what he's going to discover there. Again, as you said, the deep guerrilla fighting and that deep resilience there. And then about a year later, Che Guevara writes about North Korea that it, I'm going to quote here, was a tiny country resurrected from the ashes of American bombardment and invasion, and had successfully industrialized, which again was so important to the idea of this overall revolution. So I might here to talk about Che Guevara in North Korea.
Yeah, Che Guevara is an interesting figure in his own right, but I also think it's interesting how his martyrdom has played out with his image plastered on T-shirts, people still wearing the Che Guevara style berets. He really has become almost a symbol of revolutionary socialism in some ways. In North Korea, Che Guevara was a symbol. He became the ideal communist archetype. What I mean by that is Kimmelson even mentioned that the blood of Che Guevara will be remembered. In essence, he hoped that there would be three Vietnams around the world. This was something that was actually articulated by Che Guevara. Che Guevara, he was represented in propaganda posters in North Korea. His image was even in the Rodong Shinmun, the main newspaper in North Korea. Che Guevara also admired the North Korean system. That quote that you read there was after a tour of the Eastern Bloc, and he actually specified that North Korea was the country that most appealed to him. And you might be thinking, oh, that's crazy, right? Like North Korea, it's like a poor state now, it's really impoverished. But like back in the 1960s, it looked like a really successful country that had resurrected from what Che Guevara called the ashes of the Korean War. And the U.S. air bombing was quite brutal. But what I find interesting about Che Guevara's relationship with Kim Il-sung is that his image was in North Korean state-run media. You don't get that often of a foreign leader repeatedly coming up in North Korean state-run media, even after their death. That's typically something that's only reserved for the Mount Paektu bloodline, the Kim family. But the fact that he got that kind of treatment suggests that there was almost kind of this use. He has a usefulness in terms of his memory.
I found that incredibly interesting throughout. When I did, there's a lot of detail here, just how much they glorified Guevara, and I kept thinking this would be impossible to see today, or very unlikely to see today in North Korea. But I might also talk about how the North Koreans perhaps valorized the Cubans in some way. And this, we might start in 1961 with the Bay of Pigs. And of course, the Rodong Shinmun starts writing about this in obvious terms. You think that, so this is a quote here, stop the U.S. imperialists' armed invasion of Cuba. But there's a much more interesting quote here that I found that you have in your book from the Rodong Shinmun as well. And it says, the Cuban people guard their combat posts. Some of the people are fighting off invasion. Some have taken vigilant guard of the country's coastlines, while others are raising production results in factories and sugarcane plantations. So you can see the socialist element here. They're not just holding Cuba up as an ideal that is fighting off American imperialism, but also as a socialist idea that is succeeding in terms of its all the things that socialism promises, those improved outputs and improved quality of life.
I also think a big reason for why North Korea might have talked about like that military readiness of the Cubans is to suggest that it wasn't just themselves who were preparing for like a possible U.S. invasion. It was almost, to borrow Benedict Anderson's term, an imagined community, that it wasn't just us in the struggle against imperialism. There was this small country on the other side of the world which was also facing the same threats and also undergoing this mass mobilization for being military prepared. So I really found that quote to be interesting as well. And for the North Koreans, it was actually kind of a unique circumstance in which there was a North Korean agent who actually planted a bomb on Korean Airlines Flight 858 in 1987. So she was actually the daughter of a North Korean diplomat. She was raised in Cuba during the 1960s, and she recalled her father taking her to the beaches at the Bay of Pigs and telling her that the U.S. imperialists might come again to try to invade the small Caribbean island. So I think that, like, there's almost this sense that, like, we're not alone in this, that there's another people, there's another country which kind of shares our same mentality, kind of shares almost our same paranoia.
There's another, of course, interesting episode here, of course, which is the Cuban Missile Crisis, which comes about. And the lesson learned here for North Korea, I think, is incredibly prescient when you write it in your book here. And it's run something like this, that Kim Il-sung watches this showdown between the two great powers. And he learns something important about the Soviet Union, at least he says. And he says, I think the quote here is, they were buddy-buddy with Eisenhower and Kennedy, and something like they had betrayed the Cubans and the revolution. And it seemed to be, I'm not sure how you see it, but it seemed to be a moment of a light bulb going off in the head of Kim Il-sung, that he, in fact, could not trust the Soviet Union in moments of crisis.
Yes, in North Korean studies, there's a big debate about when North Korea officially decided that they were going to invest in a nuclear weapons program. Some scholars have suggested that the Cuban Missile Crisis was that first step, that first trigger, as you called it. I think that it's very possible that what happened to Cuba was something that motivated Kim Il-sung to start really investing in nuclear power. He really thought that Fidel Castro was betrayed by the Soviet leadership. He thought that during their time of need, the Soviet Union kind of just let them be, because Castro really wanted to launch nukes at the United States. It was actually the Soviets who held him back. Castro is really the military adventurist in this crisis. I mean, there's tons of really great books about the Cuban Missile Crisis, and my treatment of the Cuban Missile Crisis is very minuscule in the grand scheme of my book. But I think there is so much interesting research that has been on the Cuban Missile Crisis, and there's a scholar, James Pearson, who has actually also done research on how Kim Il-sung thought about the Cuban Missile Crisis and how that might have impacted his mindset and his mentality. And when it comes to the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kim Il-sung linked that with the Third World Movement. He saw the events as intertwined, and he felt that an obligation to assist national liberation struggles. And so he thought that Moscow wasn't doing enough for third world countries such as Cuba. He thought that it was the Soviet Union just acting like what all other great powers have done in the past, and that is just for their own self-interest.
So what did the relationship look like in actual material terms here? Because importantly, you mentioned things like North Korea, the Korea-Cuba Friendship Week, and all these type of corporations. Of course, there's this episode when there's this hurricane hits Cuba, and there's a lot of aid sent to Cuba from North Korea. But there's also, it seems to be, at least in first place, a cultural exchange. So you're right that the exchange, at least originally, would be scientists and educators and writers and artists and athletes and so on. So what did the actual exchange look like? I know you mentioned just briefly that there were some troops sent to North Korea. To Cuba.
Yeah, so there, when you research North Korean history, it's always hard to get actual statistics on material exchanges. You can find a lot about, the ideological and symbolic gestures in North Korean state-run media, but it's very rare that North Korean propagandists would alert the world that they were sending fighters to Cuba. That wasn't the case. They didn't want the U.S. government and its intelligence agencies to know about that. But what we have is the Woodrow Wilson Center's digital archive, which consists of archival materials from North Korea's former communist allies. And there has been some really, really interesting resources that have been found in that archive that I use in my book. One thing that I found is that North Korea sent around 700 volunteer fighters in the mid-1960s to assist the, quote, Cubans against U.S. imperialism. So what exactly did these volunteer fighters do? I'm not sure. They could have just helped with the sugarcane harvest. They could have actually been advising and helping the Cuban armed forces. A lot of North Korea's military activities abroad are still highly classified. I mean, you can't go to Pyongyang and ask to see if you can find the archives of the Korean People's Army. But I do think that there most likely were North Korean military advisors in Cuba, and there probably was an exchange of soldiers between the two countries. That's my supposition. But in addition to military exchanges, the North Koreans also did send, for example, rice, tractors, axes, saws, hammers, and medicine after the Hurricane Flora of 1963. There was also a really kind of interesting dynamic in terms of how there was farms named after, for example, there was a Cuban Friendship Cooperative Farm that was established in North Korea. And I think that kind of tells you that there might have also been some agricultural exchanges between the two countries as well. So, there's a lot. One of the things I want my book to do is open up future areas of research for young scholars. I want people to write a book about North Korea, Cuba, because my short little section about this alliance is just the beginning. I feel like there's so much more to uncover about North Korea's activities in the world.
Let's talk about how the relationship takes a small dip here. And I think this is a very prescient moment. This is March 28th, 1965, and this is inside North Korea. And this is the Cuban ambassador to North Korea. I'm going to mispronounce his name probably, Lazaro Vigoa.
I think that's about
that's about right. He was touring Pyongyang, and at some point on the tour, him and his wife, they stop in their car and they start taking pictures of a building that had been bombed out during the Korean War. And the local Koreans, North Koreans, they take offense to this, and they actually quite violently attack him and his car. They hide, the Cubans hide in their car. And this is an incredibly prescient moment, because for all the internationalism that was at least championed in the Rodong Shinmun and from the Cuban side, it's not just anger at what was happening, as in they weren't happy with the photographs. These were racial slurs being thrown at the Cubans, and particularly the ambassador's wife, who was Afro-Cuban. So let's talk about this moment and just what it says about North Korean ideology underneath the newspapers and the newspaper headlines.
Yeah, so that incident is really interesting because it captures so many facets of North Korean history. On one hand, you have the racial aspect, the fact that the diplomat's wife was Afro-Cuban, and allegedly the North Korean mob that attacked their car was launching racial slurs at them. So there's almost this kind of, on one hand, they were officially promoting this third world multiracial solidarity, but it doesn't seem to have trickled down to the common people. On another hand, you have a violent attack on a friendly foreign delegation. That's not something that happens often, and it's because they were taking pictures of rubble, and the fact that North Koreans didn't want that to be kind of seen as the face of their country. They don't want to be seen as a country that was undergoing construction. It was kind of this way of saving face, so to speak. And I also think that this is interesting because the documents that I used for this incident came from East Germany. The East Germans kept really great records of their activities abroad. The East German embassy in Pyongyang was really, really meticulous in their note-taking. There's a whole bunch of documents hosted on the Woodrow Wilson's digital archive that come from German archives. And so This incident here should have derailed the Cuban-North Korean alliance, but it didn't. And I think that kind of is a way of just showing how tight those bonds were.
And as you mentioned the East German archive there, one of the things that stood out to me from your book, and this is one of the ways in which some of these countries begin to fall out of love with North Korea, and that is the East German diplomat is being quoted here, and he was talking about what happened to the Cubans. And it seems one of the things that the Cubans were most upset about in the incident wasn't that they were being attacked, but when the North Korean security forces came to actually put down the people and to bring some calm to the situation. I'm going to quote here. He said they were so brutal. And he says they extraordinary brutality against the crowd, including children. They struck these people, including the children, with butts of their weapons. And it seems that the Cubans, for all the fear they had, they were almost most upset about the extreme internal repression of the North Koreans.
That's a really, I just love that quote, because North Korea's state security services were routinely cited by visitors from the Third World as being really brutal. For example, Eldridge Cleaver, the leader of the Black Panther Party, he went to North Korea and he visited twice in the late 1960s. And he said that the North Korean police made him miss the police of Oakland, California. Obviously, the police of Oakland, California were not kind to the Black Panthers. And so there was also an incident in which it's one of my favorite quotes in my entire book, perhaps the favorite. It comes in the conclusion, and it's a Peruvian poet. He talks about how he really admired the North Korean post-war rehabilitation and its economic recovery, but as a poet, this country struck deep sadness in his heart. And I think that is really telling about how a lot of third world governments viewed North Korea. On one hand, it was this country that had rapidly industrialized. It kind of stood up to the Americans. It was anti-imperialist. They backed up their words with actions. But on the other hand, it was a brutally repressive regime and system. And you can only kind of promote your political style so much if it means crushing the kind of the humanity of the citizens. No other government wants to adopt that political style for the most part. So, a large part of my book kind of looks at the internationalism of North Korea. The fact that you hear about North Korea today and it's a reclusive, the hermit state, it's isolated. You always hear those terms with North Korea. My book opens up a unique dialogue in which, no, it wasn't always that way. This is a country that actually changes. This is a country that adapts to international conditions. It doesn't have to be this way. It doesn't have to be so isolated. It is a country that is not stagnant. It's not an anachronism. I think so often we kind of just term North Korea as this Stalinist relic, and we don't give it credit for how much it has actually changed.
I might actually read that quote. Actually, I found that so fascinating. I highlighted it at the end of your book. I was going to mention it towards the end of the podcast, but I might read it now because it's so enlightening, this quote by the Peruvian writer, and when he's speaking about North Korea. So he writes, he says this: they fought the North Americans, and they've done incredible things in the economy. It's the only third world country where everyone has good health, good education, and good housing. And then he continues with the very next line. It's the saddest, most miserable country I've ever been to in my life. As a poet, it strikes bleakness into my heart. I thought that was an extraordinary quote from this guy.
Yeah, I love that quote, and that's why I left it for the conclusion. Because it's really, it kind of tells you all that North Korea represented to developing countries. On one hand, it was successful. Like he mentions the healthcare. North Korea has a really high percentage of doctors to people. It has a lot of medical services for its people. It has some of the best vaccination and inoculation campaigns. But the medical equipment there is horrible. Rusty scalpels, outdated medical equipment, not enough medicines. There's always two sides to these things, right? So like, okay, you can have a ton of doctors, but if they don't have the proper medical supplies, they can only do so much. And it's also like, what was behind the scenes? what were the third world visitors to North Korea actually seeing? And I think that quote there really gets at it, is because that Peruvian poet, Gennaro Checa, he visited North Korea several times. And so he started to really see what was behind the surface, what was going behind the officially approved trips, and what the minders are telling me. And what he saw is kind of the lack of humanity that was granted to the North Koreans, the human rights abuses, the lack of freedoms, the kind of just total domination of the North Korean people's consciousness by the government.
I really hope you're enjoying this episode of the podcast, and I apologize for this interruption, but I'm just going to take this moment to remind our listeners that we've made a conscious decision here in the KoreanNet podcast not to run advertising in any way. So if you do enjoy the podcast, and you listen regularly, and you do want it to continue, it is important that you do your best to support us at the links below, or by sharing, liking, or commenting on the podcast across social media. All your help in this regard is invaluable. And now back to the episode. There is an interesting moment. So the Cuban ambassador, he eventually gets away from the situation. And when he's leaving the country later on in his stay, when he's having his farewell lunch, Kim Il-sung is there. And it seems that the Cubans and the North Koreans, in some ways, though different degrees, bond over their increasing dislike for what is happening in China. So at this luncheon, he calls, Kim Il-sung says Mao's Cultural Revolution was very problematic. He later calls it unbelievable idiocy. And of course, this is coming back at him from across in China, where the Chinese call him a fat revisionist. And it seems like there seems to be this odd bond between North Korea and Cuba as they fall out of favor, or at least become disillusioned with the larger Chinese neighbor.
Yes, there was a kind of this unity of small powers in the socialist bloc, because the Soviets, they couldn't always be trusted. What they did during the Cuban Missile Crisis was a wake-up call to Kim Il-sung, as we talked about. Also, China during the Cultural Revolution was like deeply kind of like, well, not say deeply, I say openly hostile to the North Korean leadership. The Red Guard set up loudspeakers on the border with North Korea and were shouting like anti-Kim Il-sung slogans, like calling him a fat revisionist, which is like in socialist lexicon, that's a huge no-no. And so there was kind of almost this bonding, because the Cultural Revolution to the North Koreans was a threat. It was like a domestic security threat. They really were nervous about Maoist extremism pouring over into their borders. If you look at North Korean history, there were no Red Guards there. There was no kind of this bottom-up movement of revolutionary socialism. Mao, he basically kind of lost control of the Red Guards. They became more radical and had more revolutionary fervor than he actually ever had. But there's nothing of that sort in North Korea. And North Korea kind of prided themselves on being this third world model of law and order. And so what Cuba and North Korea did is Cuba would allow the North Koreans to hold press conferences at their embassy in which they condemned Chinese accusations of revisionism. The Hungarian embassy in Cuba even commented, "This fact sheds light upon the strength of the Cuban-Korean contacts." So there was like a really kind of almost anti-China sentiment shared by the Cubans and the North Koreans during the Cultural Revolution. But what the North Koreans continuously did is they played off the Soviets and the Chinese off of each other. Like, during the Cultural Revolution, the North Koreans would buddy up a little bit more with the Soviet Union, specifically during the late 1960s. But after the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was a little bit more positive relations between Beijing and Pyongyang. So it was a way to kind of play off the two communist powers for mass amounts of aid.
So let's leave North Korea there. And on that note that you mentioned earlier about how it's an under-researched area, this relationship between Cuba and North Korea. And you do mention at the end of that particular section how there is a lot more work to be done here. So let's leave that at that moment and push through a couple more chapters in your book, and we'll eventually get to Palestine. So the next chapter is entitled Il-Sungism Beyond North Korean Borders, 1968 to 1971. And this seems to be a moment in North Korean history where the shift, of course, as the title indicates there, turns back to the character of the great leader. And they are assistant non-state actors. They're bringing a lot of foreign diplomats and foreign delegations into North Korea, and all these friendship societies start popping up. So let's start there and tell us what this period looks like.
Yeah, so the second chapter is also kind of one of my favorites, probably because it's kind of quirky. Like there's some interesting findings of that archival findings of North Korean diplomats selling North Korean propaganda ads to African newspaper editors. And the African newspaper editors being like, sure, we'll print your propaganda if you hand over money. And there's like a degree of agency by a lot of these African newspaper editors where they started ratcheting up the price of the ads because they knew the North Koreans would pay them. And I'm sure a lot of the North Korean diplomats probably thought this was silly. But in a system like North Korea's, you don't question what's coming from the top. You don't question, oh, should I put this Kimmelson ad in this obscure Nigerian newspaper for thousands of dollars, even though I know it's a complete waste of money? Like you don't question that. And so you have the North Koreans putting full page ads in newspapers in countries like Sierra Leone and Nigeria and South Yemeni newspapers in Tanzania. So, if you would like to read more about this and hear more about this, I encourage you to read my book. That's probably one of my favorite sections because it's kind of, honestly, it's quite funny. Mm-hmm. It's quite funny that the North Koreans were using so much of their limited financial resources for something that was so silly. And it wasn't actually just third world newspapers that they put these full page ads in. I've written an article for NKnews in which the North Koreans actually put full-page ads in the New York Times and the Boston Globe and the Washington Post. So you have like an article that says, we have attained 8 million tons of grain. Thank you, like great leader Kim Il-sung. And that's like in the New York Times. And that cost them thousands and thousands of dollars. You can go to the archives of the New York Times newspaper. You can find North Korean propaganda in them. It's really interesting. I think it's just such a kind of quirky North Korean thing, but I think it's an element of their system. It's a product of their system in which, probably the North Korean diplomat or the poor guy who had to pay for those funds probably thought it was a complete waste of time. He was right, but you don't question it because that probably most likely came from the tippy top, the leaders.
That's, as you mentioned, the economics of things there. Let's step into the next chapter then again, and this is entitled Kim Il-sung's Career First Policy, 1972 to 1979. And for anyone with a grasp or a rudimentary grasp on Korean history, they know what is happening in this period. This is where the South Korean economy surpasses the North Korean economy. And it really does build a huge amount of tension. Our last podcast that we chatted about was talking about these border disputes and these small skirmishes, but it's a period in North Korean life where they increasingly become violent and incursionary towards South Korea. And they look around the world and they are building workers and working societies there, building up the idea of global juche, which you may want to touch on here. And they are increasingly funding non-state actors around the globe. So let's touch that chapter there.
Yeah, so my chapter 3 touches on what I call Kim Il-sung's Korea First policy, where it becomes kind of more nationalistic. So what the North Koreans did is that they funded and supported juche study groups around the world. Juche is kind of the ideology of North Korea that promotes self-reliance. Maybe a better word than ideology is more like an attitude or mentality. And a lot of third world governments actually kind of already shared this discourse of self-reliance. What I found very interesting is that when third world government leaders would go to North Korea and the North Koreans would tell them about the glories of Juche, they'd be like, yeah, that actually kind of sounds like our own concept. There's a kind of an article from the Tanzanians where they talked about, Juche reminds us of our own concept of Ujamaa. Mobutu Sese Seko says that, we have our own concept of authenticity, which is so similar to your concept of Juche. So Juche was something that was part of the third world developmental discourse. It was part of this shared anti-colonial vernacular. The Eldridge Cleaver, the leader of the Black Panthers, he went to North Korea and he talked about, Juche is like means for the Koreans to carry out their revolution. For us, it means we're going to carry out our own revolution back in the United States. There's an article in the Black Panther newspaper where Eldridge Cleaver talks about how Juche for them means that they have to use whatever they can in the struggle, so that whether it's a broken chicken bones, pork chops, or hypodermic needles, this is what they call Juche. That's actually a quote from a Black Panther newspaper article that I found. So this kind of indigenous adaptation of Juche is what I find so interesting, because it wasn't as if Juche was like something uniquely Korean. Self-reliance, self-sufficiency kind of, it's not a very complicated value system, but a lot of countries, they shared these feelings, they shared these values, they had a similar attitude. And I do think it's something that united their dialogue and their rhetoric.
So let's jump to the next chapter, and this is the chapter where we're going to speak about Palestine and the conflict there. So this chapter is called Kim Il-sung's World and Revolutionary Violence, 1980 to 1983. But I might just wind back here just slightly, because we brushed over something which is going to be very important here for context for the Palestinian discussion, and that goes back to the late 1960s and early 1970s. And this is North Korea and Kim Il-sung supporting Arab armies and Arab governments in their multiple wars against the Israeli state. And Kim Il-sung is talking about Israeli aggressors and that these Israeli aggressors are puppets of American imperialism. And of course, the allusion here to the South Korean puppets of American imperialism is obvious for everyone to see, but they are supporting, particularly it seems, Egypt in these conflicts, but they are building out military ties to countries such as Syria. So let's wind back there for just a moment, and then we'll get into 1980s Palestine.
Yeah, so North Korea has never really been friendly to Israel. It's principally because they view Israel as a lackey of Washington. The way that they view Israel is almost similar as how they view South Korea, in terms of that they view it as a U.S. puppet state. And North Korea, their view of Israel is actually very similar to the way East Germany saw Israel. And there was almost kind of this unique kind of propaganda caricatures of Israeli soldiers. So I actually was looking at a North Korean magazine. I think it was Cholima. I reference this in my book. And there is an Israeli soldier who's being pelted with stones, and he has like this hooked nose and these he looks almost beast-like. It really is reminiscent of the way that Nazis once represented Jews in their own propaganda. And, it's very similar in that kind of anti-Semitic caricatures. And that was in North Korean propaganda. And the way that the North Koreans talked about North Korea in their state-run, or the way that North Koreans talked about Israel in their state-run media, was always negative. It was never positive. They really thought that Palestine was a country that was brutally colonized by the Israelis. They thought that Egypt was the leader of the Arab world and leader of anti-Zionism. They supported Egypt during the Yom Kippur War. They sent pilots to Egypt to help to help them in their fight against Israel. They were very cozy with Palestinian liberation movements like the PLO. I'm sure we'll talk about this a bit later here, but for example, Yasser Arafat arrived in North Korea in 1981, and he visited Pyongyang and met with Kimmelson. So there was a close kind of relationship between what you could perhaps call Arab left-leaning nationalists in their struggle against Israel, and how they also supported Pyongyang.
Let's go to that moment with Yasser Arafat then. So he is the leader of the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization. And as you said, he arrives in 1981. And one of the remarkable things about his arrival, you mentioned this abnormal glorification of Che Guevara earlier. And the welcome that Arafat gets is incredibly unusual as well. So you write here, 100,000 North Koreans lie in the streets, and he is met at the Kumsan Assembly Hall by Kim Il-sung himself. This is huge this huge banquet is put on in Arafat's honor, and there's these wonderful, gallant speeches made about the glorious fight the Palestinians are doing. So let's talk about this extraordinary welcome that Arafat gets.
Yeah, the North Koreans don't always put the red carpet out for all their foreign delegations. Like if you are the leader of the Danish Communist Party, you're not getting that kind of welcome. You're not getting 100,000 North Koreans lining the streets of Pyongyang to welcome you. You're not getting to sit down with Kim Il-sung. You might for maybe 5 minutes, but, Kim Il-sung really put out the red carpet for Yasser Arafat. And I think that tells you something about how the North Korean leadership viewed Palestine and they viewed Yasser Arafat. I have a quote here that there was a banquet held in Arafat's honor, and Kim proclaimed, "The Korean people have always expressed firm support to the just struggle of the Palestinian people to retake Palestine, their sacred homeland, and restore their inalienable legitimate national rights, including the right to return home, the right to self-determination, the right to found a sovereign state." And I think that quote there is a really good, is emblematic of the way that the North Korean leadership viewed the Palestinian struggle. They thought it was a travesty in many ways. They thought it was a travesty that the Israelis, backed by the U.S., kind of took away their homeland. And even today, if you look at North Korean state-run media, they're always very sympathetic to Palestine and always very hostile to Israel. This is one of those continuations of North Korean foreign policy.
And this sympathy becomes incredibly significant in a couple of moments. So importantly, you write in 1963, Khalil al-Wazir, a founding member of Fatah, he arrives in North Korea for military training. And that may not jump off the page to many people's ears, the significance of that. But when you look at another splinter group of the PLO, and this is an organization that has Muhammad Dawood Awad is one of its members, who also arrives in Pyongyang in this time in 1970 for military training. He and his organization, of course, are the people who planned and attacked the Israeli athletes in 1972 at the Munich Olympics. So this is slightly different to some other episodes that we've discussed so far. I know this has comparisons, and that people like the IRA also traveled to North Korea for training, but the actual impact of this training seems to be incredibly significant.
Yeah, there's not a lot of research about this. The fact that North Korea hosted and trained third world insurgents, whether it was the PLO, whether it was members of the Irish Republican Army, whether it was members of other insurgent organizations from all over the anti-colonial world. So North Korea, at certain points, they perhaps hosted around 1,000 to 2,000 foreign fighters, trained them on military camps on the outskirts of Pyongyang. These camps were almost kind of like revolutionary hubs for the North Koreans to promote their own kind of soft power and military system. Kim Il-sung, he wanted people to go abroad and kind of use his experiences from the guerrilla struggle against the Japanese for their own movements. There is not a lot of research about this. It's most likely because North Korea obviously did not openly advertise this or talk about this at all in their official documents. If you go to North Korea today and ask some government official, did you guys actually train like third world terrorists during the Cold War era? They'll be like, what? They probably have no clue, or they'll just deny it. This is something that is remarkably under-researched, principally because it's still classified. It's hard to get a lot of information about it, but North Korea did host and train a number of really important Third World revolutionaries, such as Muhammad Daoud Awada, who was one of the planners of the attack on Israeli athletes at the 1972 Munich Olympics. So this wasn't your average, Joe Schmo from Palestine who just want to learn how to, make a bomb. This was one of the kind of the chief PLO planners.
I want to talk about the nature of some of the propaganda, and you mentioned just how reminiscent it is of some of the Nazi propaganda here. But one of the elements in this, and the way that North Koreans compare Israeli people to Americans as well, and again in that same horribly reminiscent anti-Semitic way, is it seems to be done in a way of you can never trust them, as in they may seem like they wanted peace. And you write here that there's an image in one of the magazines, I believe it's Cholima as well, and it's this American capitalist. He's wearing a large cap and he's handing money to an Israeli pilot. And as we look through it, the real message behind it is you can never trust them. It's all about money. It's always going to be two-faced. No matter whenever these imperialists look for peace, they are always still trying to undermine us. And you can see how this has a history, and that painful, horrible history towards anti-Semitism. But they are also using this same anti-Semitic trope to describe modern-day American administrations.
Yes, it's it's just interesting how that hook knows that representation of whether it's American soldiers or Israeli soldiers has such a dark history. It comes, the Nazis used it in terms of how they saw Jews as almost unhuman, subhuman. And the North Koreans, and also there's some other socialist countries that really represented the Israelis as also kind of being like beneath them. So in many ways, I write here that North Korea's Palestine policy mirrored that of another divided communist nation, East Germany. The Soviet Union and its allies turned the language of anti-fascism during World War II into a rhetorical weapon against Israel. And North Korea adopted a similar approach and viewed Zionism as an outdated imperialist ideology. So it's something that wasn't totally unique to the North Koreans. It unfortunately was something that was around the socialist bloc in terms of just kind of like, there was like anti-Semitism in terms of how they represented and treated Israel, unfortunately. It's there's some good research being done on this by Jeffrey Herf, who's actually a historian of East Germany.
Let's talk about what happened inside North Korea then, because this is reminiscent of some of those, they may say superficial ceremonies that were used in the Cuban analogy that we had earlier, and that is North Korea seems to be very fond of this type of thing. When they're trying to build up a friendship, they create as I'm going to quote here, a day of world solidarity with the Palestinian people, and then later a week of Palestinian solidarity. So how common is this? Because it seems to be very reminiscent of what they did with the Cubans. I know it probably is a symbol rather than substance here, but this seems to be something that the North Koreans like to do, create days and weeks and dedicate them towards their alliances around the world.
Yeah, they do that, but it's not something that's kind of strange. I mean, think about it here in the U.S. Like, I think today was like take back your drugs day. Like, throw out your unused medications. Another day this week was like Earth Day. We have all kind of strange like holidays here in the Western world. It's just that in North Korea, you have Day of World Solidarity with the Palestinian people, or Week of Solidarity with the fighting Cuban people. They just kind of adapt it for their own unique political system. So that's kind of an interesting way in which the North Korean system is perhaps not so dissimilar from our own. There's all sorts of strange holidays here in the United States. I think, there's like, it's cute pickle day or something. It's just that in North Korea, they sometimes have their own anti-imperialist celebration, specifically, with a country that they have close ties with.
So as we wind towards the end of the interview here, let's jump into your next chapter, the last chapter before the conclusion, and that's entitled Survival by Any Means Necessary, 1984 to 1989. And this is interesting because it's a period where Seoul has this big breakout moment with the 1988 Olympics. It's also a period in South Korea where Chun Doo-hwan is in power and the democratizing movement is coming to the fore. It's a time where there's the Rangoon bombings, and North Korea are reaching out to the world in all these extraordinary ways, and they seem to have an increased presence in much of Africa as well throughout this period. You have you're right here in 1984. North Korea had military experts in Angola, Benin, Congo, Libya, Madagascar, Mozambique, the Seychelles, Tanzania, Uganda, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. So let's touch on that period there.
Yeah, North Korea was very active in Africa during the Cold War era. They're all over Africa, building stadiums, helping to train militaries, selling weapons, even trafficking ivory and rhino horn. The North Koreans, their relationship with one country in Africa, Uganda, is what I find perhaps the most interesting. So they supported Idi Amin's brutal regime in Uganda. Idi Amin was overthrown by a guy named Milton Obote, who was actually imprisoned by Idi Amin. Obote had close relations with Kimmelson. Obote was later overthrown by a guerrilla fighter named Yoheri Museveni. The North Koreans supported Museveni, and I think this is interesting that in the aspect that some of these African governments can literally change overnight their leaderships. As long as you pay up and support the North Koreans, they will be okay with you. Shows how adaptable they are in terms of their foreign policy.
There's one episode before we end here that I really do want to touch on, because I think this gives a good perspective on North Korea here and how they weren't as ideologically pure as they claim to have been. And this is the case, perhaps quite prescient with where we are today, with the Soviet presence in Afghanistan in 1979. And you write here, and through a really interesting section of your book, where throughout this whole Soviet-Afghan war, Pyongyang consistently aligns itself with Moscow being the imperial power here. And of course, this upsets people like its Pakistani neighbors and people like this. But I think it's a really important moment here that it does shine a light on what is behind an awful lot of the North Korean rhetoric.
Yeah, there's a tension in North Korean foreign policy in terms of how they treated Soviet Union. They could never get too far from Moscow. They could never anger them too far. So when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, the Chinese thought that was a horrible decision by Moscow. But the North Koreans supported Soviet policy in Afghanistan. They sent a congratulatory message in the Rodong Shinmun to Soviet-installed African President Barbara Kemal in 1980. They never criticized the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and their puppet regime that they had installed there. This kind of shows you that North Korea was malleable. Their anti-imperialism perhaps extended only so far. it is also a way that I think is representative of how they treat China today. China and North Korea have North Korea has very close economic ties with China. They can never go too far from angering Beijing. For example, you'll never see the North Koreans criticizing China policy in Xinjiang or criticizing how China treats Hong Kong. That'll never happen. And I think that's kind of, you see parallels here with how Pyongyang never criticized the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan.
So as a very last question, let's move into the conclusion of your book here, and with a really interesting look at the present and the future here. So we mentioned earlier, though, that interesting quote by the Peruvian poet, and let's touch on some of that moment here, because I'm going to give you a couple of quotes from your book, because I think this is interesting for people who have some perspective of what we've been talking about and what is explained in much more detail within your book. You write, according to some in the Third World, the DPRK was a model state. This is in stark contrast to the current view that North Korea is stuck in time and a Cold War relic, a modern day anachronism. And I thought that's an interesting way to look at it, as in this is how much in the Third World did look towards North Korea. It wasn't as it often is today. But then towards the end of your conclusion, you have this particular quote: the Third World responded and for the most part turned its back on North Korea. And that's because North Korea began doing all sorts of things, such as setting off bombs in Rangoon, hacking the central bank of Bangladesh. They seem to be incredibly unscrupulous in the early to late 2000s about how they operated around the world and how they operate today.
Yes, North Korea is a contradiction in many ways. On one hand, they are a deeply impoverished country. I believe only about 10% of the roads in North Korea are paved. The medical system there is something that is reminiscent of medieval times. But on the other hand, they have some of the most sophisticated cyber hackers in the world. They have a sophisticated nuclear weapons program. Those are not something that poor countries typically have. It's a contradiction. That contradiction of North Korea is something that has always been there. During the Cold War era, on one hand, it was this country that had successfully recovered from the Korean War and was self-reliant. But on the other hand, it was deeply subsidized and reliant on the Soviet Union for its economy and economic rehabilitation after the Korean War. It was a country that was also did not go too far in criticizing Soviet foreign policy. So this kind of North Korea is just, in many ways, it's a contradiction, but it's not a modern day anachronism. For what I mean by that is that it's a country that changes. It's a country that adapts to international conditions. And I think that this is one of the reasons why this country is still around today. It's very, very resilient. This is a country that survived a famine in the mid-1990s, the death of its founding leader, and the collapse of its largest benefactor, the Soviet Union. The fact that it survived all of those things and it's still around today, and it actually developed a nuclear arsenal, is remarkable in many ways. And I think sometimes Westerners in particular don't understand why would North Koreans support such a government? Are they just being held down by the leadership there? But I think there is a degree of popular support in North Korea that we don't take account for. Like there's a lot of pride in the North Korean system amongst North Koreans. And yes, there is ideological brainwashing there. There is an information blockade, but there is also a degree of popular support for the regime there. And I don't think that should ever be discounted. It's an important part of why North Korea is still around today.
And for more details on all of this, get your hands on Ben's book. The two chapters that we spoke about today were not chapters at all. So we spoke about Palestine and Cuba in detail. There were small sections within larger chapters. I cannot begin to express how the smaller part of Ben's book we actually touched on. So please go get your hands on it. It is incredibly informative, and you get a huge amount of detail about the world and a much more improved view of the nature of the North Korean state. The book is called Guns, Guerillas, and the Great Leader, North Korea and the Third World. Ben Young, thanks again. It's always a pleasure to speak to you. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Jed. I enjoyed speaking to you too.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the podcast. I really hope you enjoyed it. This is just a final reminder that we've made a conscious decision here on the Korea Now podcast not to run advertising. And so the podcast is entirely funded by you, the listener. So if you do want it to continue, please consider supporting the podcast at the PayPal or Patreon links attached below. Or importantly, you can share, like, or comment on the podcast across social media. And on that, I hope to see you again for the next episode. Thanks again for listening.